I've been working at Callaway and Reed for 3 months now, and I still don't know exactly how to describe what kind of bookstore it is. That sounds like a strange thing to admit about a place you spend 40 hours a week inside. But bear with me. It's not a chain. It's not quite a used bookstore either, though it smells like one, that particular smell of old paper that some people find comforting and other people find suffocating, depending on what kind of childhood they had. It's an independent shop that's been on the same block in the same mid-sized city since 1987. Floor space is maybe 2,500 square feet, which sounds like enough until you realize every inch of wall is shelving, and half the floor is too. There are these narrow paths between the stacks that a larger person genuinely has to turn sideways to get through. The overhead lighting was designed by someone who either hated reading or had never done it. So most of the actual light comes from little clip-on lamps that previous employees attached to shelves over the years. They're all different shapes and wattages. Some of them flicker. The owner, a man named Gerald Callaway, there's no Reed, apparently there never was, has repeatedly said he'll rewire the whole shop someday. He's been saying that since 1994, according to the woman who trained me. Her name is Patrice. She'd been there 11 years when I arrived, which meant she'd started in her late 20s and was now closer to 40 than she'd like to be reminded of. She's the one who actually runs the shop in any practical sense. Gerald comes in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, putters around, moves a few things, makes decisions that Patrice then quietly unmakes after he leaves. He's not a bad person. He's just the kind of owner who thinks that showing up constitutes management. I got the job because I needed it. I want to be straightforward about that, because I think it matters to understand why I stayed as long as I did, even after things got strange. My previous situation, I'd been doing freelance indexing work for academic publishers, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds, had dried up over the preceding year in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself until I was 3 months behind on my car payment and eating the same 4 cheap meals on rotation. I have a degree in library science that I never fully used. The posting for a bookseller at Callaway and Reed said experience with cataloging systems preferred, and I had that, so I applied. It paid $11 an hour. I took it. My daughter was 8 years old at the time. I'll mention her here because she's relevant to why I made certain decisions later, and also because she's the person I was most thinking about during the parts of this that I'm still trying to work through. She lives with her mother, my ex-wife Dana, about 20 minutes from the shop. I see Mara on weekends and Wednesday evenings when I can manage it. The financial trouble I'd accumulated wasn't just embarrassing in an adult way. It was the kind of trouble that starts to make you worry about things, like whether you can keep paying your half of the orthodontist, whether you can still take her somewhere decent on her birthday in March. Small fears that compound. Anyway, the job. My first week was unremarkable in most ways. Patrice showed me the inventory system, which was a piece of software from roughly 2009 that displayed everything in a font I can only describe as aggressively beige. She showed me the receiving process when shipments came in from distributors, how to log them, how to verify the packing slips, how to shelve new stock. She showed me the returns process, which is what I want to get to. But I need to describe the setup first, because it becomes important. The store has what Patrice calls the desk, which is a long wooden counter near the front that serves simultaneously as the register area, the gift wrapping station during December, the place where customers leave bags while they browse, and the place where returns get processed. There's no separate customer service counter. The desk is everything. Behind it, there's a rolling cart industrial wire shelving on wheels, The kind you'd see in a restaurant supply store where returned books sit until someone has time to check them back into inventory and reshelve them. Patrice told me the cart was usually cleared twice a day, once mid-morning and once before close. I took that seriously. I liked having a clear process. The return policy at Callaway and Reed is more generous than most independent shops. Gerald had instituted it sometime in the mid-90s as a goodwill gesture toward regular customers, and it had calcified into something permanent through sheer inertia. If you had the receipt, you could return a book within 30 days for any reason, no questions. If you didn't have the receipt, but Patrice recognized you as a regular, she used her judgment. It was an informal system, the way a lot of things at the shop were informal. But it mostly worked because the customer base was largely people who had been shopping there for decades and weren't trying to cheat anyone. I mention all of this because for my first few weeks, returns were the most ordinary thing in the world. People came in, set books on the desk, sometimes with an explanation, and sometimes without. I'd check the receipt, look the title up in the system to confirm it was in our inventory, process the refund, put the book on the cart. Simple. Clean. I was good at it. The cataloging instinct runs deep in me. I notice discrepancies. I like things to match. The first time I noticed something off, I genuinely thought I'd made an error. It was a Thursday morning in my 4th week. A man came in. I'd seen him before. One of the regulars who drifted in a few times a week, and he set a book on the desk without saying anything, which some of the regulars did. Just a wordless transaction, comfortable in the way that only happens at the kind of shop where people feel at home. The book was a collection of short stories by a writer I vaguely recognized. Mid-century, Southern Gothic. One of those writers whose name gets dropped in literary conversations more than their work gets actually read. I looked it up in the system to process the return. It wasn't there. Not as a book we'd sold. Not as a book in our current inventory. Not as a book we'd ever carried, according to the system's records, which went back about 4 years before that. Gerald had used paper logs that were stored somewhere in a back room that Patrice described as inaccessible until Gerald is ready to deal with it. I checked the receipt. The receipt was real, our logo, our address, the right paper stock, with a price and a date. The date was 11 days prior. I had been working here 11 days prior. I would have been the one to sell it, possibly, or Patrice would have. I looked at the title again, looked at the system again, tried a few alternate searches in case I'd misspelled the author's name. Nothing. I processed the return. I put the book on the cart. I thought I'd made some kind of data entry error when I first learned the system, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't. I need to explain something about how the system works, or how it's supposed to work, because I kept coming back to this. When we sell a book, the inventory count in the system decrements. When we receive a book, it increments. The system isn't perfect. Nothing this old is perfect. But it does maintain a record of transactions. Sales appear in a log with timestamps. If we had sold that book 11 days ago, there should have been a transaction record. There wasn't. If we had carried the book at all, there should have been a product entry. There wasn't one of those either. The simplest explanation was that Patrice had sold something off-system. That happened occasionally with older items, especially stuff from the back room, or things Gerald brought in from his personal collection. Informal sales. They were supposed to be logged separately in a notebook kept under the desk. I checked the notebook. The title wasn't in it. I mentioned it to Patrice at the end of my shift. She was distracted. One of the light fixtures was flickering badly enough to annoy customers, and she was on the phone with an electrician, so I kept it brief. Hey, I processed a return today. on something I couldn't find in the system, a short story collection. The receipt looked right. I went ahead and did it. She said, "What was it?" I told her the title and the author. She paused for just a moment before saying, "Yeah, that happens sometimes. The system has gaps. Just put it on the cart." I had already put it on the cart, and the pause lasted maybe a second and a half, which is nothing, which could mean anything. But I noticed it the way you notice a single off note in a song you know well. You don't stop listening. You just file it somewhere. That book sat on the returns cart for 4 days before I got around to re-shelving it with the rest of the weekly returns. I carried it back to the fiction section, found the right shelf by author's last name, and slid it in. It was in decent condition. A few pages were dog-eared. Someone had written a word in pencil in the margin of the first story. I noticed it when I set it down, but I didn't read it. I wasn't looking for anything yet. 2 weeks passed. 3 or 4 more returns came through that I couldn't match in the system. Each time the receipt looked legitimate. Each time the amount was consistent with our pricing. Each time the date on the receipt was recent within the past 30 days. I started keeping my own informal log, because that's the kind of person I am. I noted the title, the author, the date on the receipt, the date I processed the return. I did it in a small spiral notebook I kept in my jacket pocket, the kind you buy at a drugstore. I told myself I was tracking potential system errors so I could raise it properly with Gerald when he came in. That was true, mostly. But I also did it because something about the pattern bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate clearly. Each of the unmatched returns was a single title. Each receipt was from a different day. None of the customers who brought them in were the same person. And every book was literary fiction. Not genre, not nonfiction, not children's, not anything else. Specifically older literary fiction, the kind of thing that gets assigned in university courses and discussed at length, and then set aside. Not rarities necessarily, but not airport rack bestsellers either. I told myself that was coincidence. The customer base at Callaway and Reed skews literary and older. Of course, the outlier returns would reflect that. I told myself the system had more gaps than Patrice had let on, and that I'd probably been making small errors in my own inventory management. I told myself a lot of things. My daughter called me on a Wednesday evening during this period I'd had to miss our usual time the week before because of a closing shift I couldn't trade, and we talked for almost an hour. She was reading a book for school, one of those books they give to 4th graders that is charming to adults, but apparently excruciating to 8-year-olds, and she wanted to complain about it to someone who would understand. I understand, I told her. I complained about books assigned to me in school until I was approximately 23. She laughed. She has her mother's laugh. After I got off the phone, I sat in my apartment for a while without turning on the TV. I'd been thinking about the returns more than I'd realized. There was something about each of those books that I kept circling. They were all, every single one of them, in slightly too good condition. Not the condition of something that's been sitting on a shelf, which typically means spine stress, some cover softening from handling, maybe a little fading if it's been in sunlight. These all looked like they'd been kept in a climate-controlled environment and handled carefully. The pages were clean. The spines were intact. They looked, to use a word that only sounds strange in retrospect, preserved. I went back the next day and pulled the short story collection from the shelf where I'd re-shelved it. I wanted to look at that margin note I'd half noticed before. I found the first story. There was the word, in neat pencil, small enough to be unobtrusive. It said again. I stood there in the narrow aisle between shelves for a moment. The clip-on lamp above me was putting out a yellowish light. There were no other customers in that section. I could hear Patrice near the front, talking to someone about a birthday gift. Everything was completely ordinary. I put the book back. I went and helped a customer find a travel guide to Portugal. At the end of my shift, I added a new column to my notebook and went back through all my entries, noting condition. Every single return I'd flagged was in that same state. Too clean, too intact. The 7th return came in on a Tuesday, which is one of the days Gerald is usually there. I processed it before he came in and I didn't mention it to him. I'm not entirely sure why. I think I'd developed a sense, and this is hard to explain, without sounding like I'd already gone down some strange road in my thinking that whatever was happening was mine to figure out first. That presenting it to Gerald before I understood it would result in the gap being explained away in some simple way that would end my ability to look at it clearly. That probably sounds like rationalization. It probably is rationalization, but it's what I did. That 7th book was a novel, something literary, mid-80s, a writer who'd had a small reputation and then drifted out of fashion. The customer who returned it was a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, polite, who said only that she'd read it and was freeing up shelf space. I processed it. The receipt checked out. The system had no record. I put it on the cart. That evening, I looked the author up online. He died in 1991. The novel had been out of print since the mid-90s. Our copy, the one the woman had just returned to us, had a price sticker on the back that matched our current pricing sticker format, which Gerald had only switched to in 2019. I sat with that for a long time. A book that went out of print before our current sticker format existed had just been returned to us with one of our current format stickers and a receipt dated 13 days ago. I went back into work the next morning before my shift started, which I'd never done before. Patrice wasn't there yet. It was just Gerald, who was making coffee in the small back room and listening to a jazz station turned low. I went to the returns cart. The woman's novel was still there from yesterday, waiting to be reshelved. I picked it up, looked at the sticker, turned it over. Inside the front cover, in the same neat pencil, same size as before, was another word. Again. I put the book back on the cart. I made sure it was in the same position. Then I went and got myself a cup of coffee from the back room, said good morning to Gerald, and listened to him talk for 10 minutes about a dispute he was having with a distributor over damaged stock. I nodded in the right places. I drank the coffee. I was thinking about the word the entire time. Again. The obvious reading is that someone had read the book before, dog-eared their favorite passages, written a note to themselves, the way readers do. It's an intimate habit. Marginalia some people treat it as vandalism, and some people treat it as conversation. The word could mean the reader had encountered a particular passage again that resonated with them from a previous reading. It could mean almost anything a reader might want to record for themselves in the moment. Except both notes were in the same handwriting, and they were both in the same position inside the front cover of the first story, or chapter, just below the title, small and unobtrusive. And they were in 2 different books, returned by 2 different people on 2 different days. I know how that sounds. I know the simpler answer is that I was pattern matching where there was no real pattern, that 2 people who write a similar way and leave similar marginal notes is well within the range of statistical noise, especially in a bookstore with a consistent customer base. I know that. I'm not an irrational person. I index things for a living, or I did. Which means I've spent years building systems to distinguish real categories from coincidental clusters. I told myself I needed more data. That is the indexer's reflex. Don't conclude from 2 points. So I started paying closer attention. The 8th return happened 4 days later. An older man, one I recognized from the regulars. He came in usually on Friday mornings and spent a long time in the history section. Occasionally bought something, set a novel on the desk without a word. I processed it, found no system record, gave him his refund. He was already halfway to the door when I thought to look at the book. I called after him, something inconsequential, asked if he was looking for anything in particular today, just to keep him there for a moment. He said no, he was just browsing. He smiled the way regulars smile when they're comfortable somewhere, a little absent, a little fond, and then he left. I opened the book, front cover, same position, same handwriting, again. I stood at the desk holding it. There was a couple near the back, debating over something in the cooking section. The overhead light above me was doing its usual thing. Outside, it was raining, a flat, gray November rain that had been going since the morning, the kind that muffles the city into something smaller. 3 books, 3 different customers. Same word, same place, same hand. I added a new column to my notebook that night. Handwriting. I wrote matching in each row. Then I sat and thought about what a normal, non-alarming explanation for that would look like. The most obvious one? A single person had written in all 3 books before they were sold. Someone who either worked here or had access to the stock before it went on the shelf. The books had been purchased, returned, and I'd been the one processing the returns and re-shelving them, so I wouldn't have noticed if the word had been there all along when the books were first shelved. That was plausible. That was more than plausible. I felt genuinely better about it for approximately 18 hours. Then I remembered that I had personally received and shelved the short story collection, the first one, the one I'd noticed first, from a distributor shipment during my 2nd week. I had opened the box. I had checked the packing slip. I had looked at each book, because that's what I do. I check things. I had looked at the cover and the spine, and confirmed the title against the list, and put it on the cart to be shelved. I did not open it to the first page at that point, because there was no reason to. But I was also nearly certain, not completely certain, but nearly, that if there had been a penciled word inside the front cover, I would have noticed it. I handle books the way some people handle tools. I pay attention to their condition by habit, except I couldn't be certain. That was the problem. I handled dozens of books in a receiving session. I don't open every single one to the first page. The honest answer is I don't know whether that word was there when the book arrived or whether it appeared at some point between arrival and return. I needed to check a book before it was returned. I went through the reshelved returns one more time. I'd put all 8 back into the stacks by this point, and I pulled each one at a time, looked inside the front cover, confirmed the word was there, replaced it. Then I went through the rest of the fiction section, which took about 40 minutes on a slow afternoon, and I checked front covers. I was looking for the same handwriting, the same position, anything that matched. Other customer marginalia exists in used bookstores constantly. I was trying to see if this particular hand showed up somewhere else. It didn't, not in fiction. I only checked fiction that day, because that's where we'd had all the unmatched returns, and because I didn't have time to go through the whole shop before Patrice needed me at the desk. What I found instead, and I almost missed this, because I was specifically looking for the penciled word, was that 3 of the 8 reshelved returns had something else in common. Each one had a small mark on the bottom edge of the pages. Not a stamp, not a sticker, more like a discoloration. A faint horizontal line across the page block, the cut edges of all the pages together, about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. The kind of thing you might see if a book had been stored somewhere with a specific humidity line, or set repeatedly on the same surface that left a trace. It was faint enough that I might have thought it was foxing or age-related marking if I hadn't been looking carefully. But it wasn't random. It was a line. Consistent. Level. I didn't know what to do with that yet. I wrote it down. Patrice had a habit of arriving at exactly 8:50 for a 9 o'clock open, making coffee, and spending the first 15 minutes reading whatever she was currently in the middle of at the desk before the day properly started. She was protective of that time in a quiet, non-aggressive way that I respected. We had developed a comfortable working rhythm by this point. I liked her. I trusted her judgment on most things. But there was that pause, the pause from my 4th week, when I'd mentioned the first unmatched return and she'd said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." And I hadn't been able to let go of it. I decided to test something. On a Thursday, Gerald's day, I processed a return before he arrived, and then mentioned it to him directly instead of Patrice. Casually, in the context of talking about the inventory system. I said I'd been noticing some gaps, returns that didn't match anything in the records. I described 2 of the books specifically, gave him titles and authors. Gerald frowned at the coffee maker while I talked. He has a specific frown for things that register as administrative inconveniences, a slight compression of his mouth, a tilting of his head forward. He did that frown. He said, "The system's always had holes. Patrice knows how to work around them." I said I'd been keeping a log, in case it was useful. He said, "Show it to Patrice. She'll know what's what." He wasn't dismissing me rudely. He just genuinely believed that Patrice would know what's what. He's built his entire professional existence on that belief, and it has more or less served him. I thanked him and dropped it. I did not show the log to Patrice. Not yet. The 9th and 10th returns came within 2 days of each other. I processed both, confirmed no system records, added them to my log, checked for the word. Both had it. Both had the line on the page block. I was now at 10 returns, spanning about 6 weeks, all literary fiction, all in unusual condition, all with 2 consistent physical markers in addition to the receipt anomaly. I had also, by this point, looked up every author. Not obsessively, I'd just started doing it automatically when I processed an anomalous return. The way you start to Google something every time a name comes up in conversation until you've absorbed the basics. What I noticed, all 10 authors were dead. Not recently dead. The most recent death had been in 2003. The earliest had died in 1952. All of them had written 1 or 2 well-regarded books, and then either died, stopped writing, or faded enough that you could go through a general interest bookstore in 2024 without expecting to find their work on the shelf. I don't want to overstate what I thought that meant. Authors die. Backlist literary fiction is full of dead writers. But combined with everything else, combined with the fact that every single return fell into this specific category, the pattern had a shape to it now. I could see the edges. I called Dana on a Friday evening, ostensibly to confirm the following weekend schedule with Mara. We talked for a few minutes beyond the logistics, the way we usually do, keeping it civil. She asked how the job was going. I said fine, I liked it. She said she was glad, in a tone that meant she was glad I was stable enough to pay my share of things. There was no edge in it. She wasn't trying to be cruel. It's just the tone you get when you've given someone reasons to worry. I said goodnight. I sat with the phone for a while after. I thought about the word again. What it would mean if it didn't refer to the reader's experience of the text. What it would mean if it was addressed outward, to the book itself. Or to someone handling the book, which was, increasingly, me. That's where my thinking was at that point. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't operating from some clear-headed investigative position. I was a man, sitting in a small apartment, financially stressed, missing his daughter, working a job that paid $11 an hour, who had decided that a recurring pencil note in returned books was aimed at him specifically. I'm aware of how that sounds. I was aware of how it sounded at the time. I kept that awareness in front of me like a lantern, because without it, I think I would have talked myself into something I couldn't talk myself back out of. Still, 11th return. The 11th return was brought in by someone I had never seen before. Not a regular. A younger woman, late 20s maybe, with the specific distracted energy of someone running an errand they want to finish quickly. She set the book on the desk, already holding her receipt out. I processed it. I looked her up in the customer database. We didn't have a formal membership system, but regulars were usually in there from past transactions. Nothing. She was already at the door when I realized I hadn't looked at the book's condition yet. I called after her, some reflexive customer service thing, about whether she'd like anything else. She paused with her hand on the door and turned, and for a moment, just a moment, she looked at the book on the desk rather than at me. It was a quick look, automatic, the way you glance back at something you've set down. Then she left. The book was in the same condition as the others, same state of preservation, lying on the page block. I opened it, again, but this time there was something else. Below the word, in the same handwriting, smaller, a date. Not formatted like a normal date, no month, no year, just a number, just 14. I stood at the desk for a long time. I was trying to think about whether I'd ever opened any of the previous books past the first page. I hadn't. I'd been checking specifically for the word, specifically inside the front cover, and stopping when I found it. I had processed 11 returns at this point. I had reshelved all 11. I had looked at the front cover of each one. I had never looked at the back. I went to the fiction section and I pulled every one of them. Inside the back cover of each book, every single one, all 11 in the same neat pencil, in the same position, was a number. I stood in the aisle with all 11 books stacked on the floor next to me, and I wrote them down in order. The numbers were not sequential. They were not dates. They didn't correspond to any publication year or price or page count I could immediately identify. They were 14, 7, 22, 3, 19, 11, 7, 4, 16, 22, 14. I looked at the numbers. I looked at them for a while. Then I started to see the shape of it, the thing underneath. 7 and 7, 22 and 22, 14 and 14. Some numbers repeated. In a string of 11 values, 3 pairs of repeats. It wasn't random. Random distributions don't cluster like that in a set this small. I know enough about indexing and cataloging systems to know that 11 items producing 3 repeat pairs means something is structured. It's either a code, a reference, or a sequence that maps to something external. I reshelved the books. I went back to the desk. My shift ended in 40 minutes. Patrice was helping someone at the register. The rain from earlier in the week had stopped, and the evening light through the front window was the particular pale amber of late autumn, which under other circumstances I find pleasant. I opened my notebook to a new page and wrote the 11 numbers down again. Then I sat there trying to think of what kind of reference system uses values between 1 and 22. The alphabet has 26 letters. Standard musical notation doesn't work. Tarot has 22 major arcana, but I dismissed that almost immediately as the kind of reach that comes from looking too hard. 22 chapters, 22 pages, 22 words into a specific text, or 22 entries in a sequence that wasn't finished yet. I went home that night and did something I'm not entirely proud of. I pulled up a used book marketplace online and searched for all 11 titles. Most of them were available. They're not rare books, not collector's items, just forgotten literary fiction that exists in the secondary market the way most things do, priced between $3 and $12 depending on condition. I was checking editions. Specifically, I wanted to know how many pages each book had. The numbers in the back covers ranged from 3 to 22. If they were page references, they'd all be well within range for any book printed after roughly 1950. That told me nothing useful. If they were word counts into a specific page, that was going to take more work. If they were chapter numbers, I'd need to know the chapter structure of each individual book. And some of these books didn't have numbered chapters at all, just sections or continuous text. I stayed up until about 1 in the morning going through it. I didn't crack it. I went to bed, feeling the particular exhaustion of someone who has been concentrating hard on the wrong thing, which is different from regular tiredness. It sits behind your eyes differently. The next morning, I made a decision that I had technically been avoiding. I went into the back room at the shop, the room Gerald has been meaning to deal with since roughly the Clinton administration, and I started looking through the paper logs. The back room is not large, and it is not organized. It contains a broken paper shredder, approximately 40 banker's boxes stacked in no discernible order, 3 folding chairs, a decommissioned cash register from what appears to be the early 90s, a shelf of cleaning supplies, and a smell that I can only describe as compressed time. Gerald had told me months ago that the logs prior to the current inventory system were in there somewhere. Patrice, when I'd asked her once about the pre-digital records, had said something vague about the boxes being Gerald's project when he got around to it and changed the subject. I checked that Patrice was occupied at the desk and that we didn't have a rush on Tuesday morning. Thin traffic. She had it handled and I started looking through boxes. The logs, when I found them, were in 3 of the banker's boxes stacked near the back wall. Ledger books, the old kind with green-ruled pages. Sales records and receiving records, organized by year, going back to 1987. The handwriting changed over the decades as different people had kept them. I wasn't looking for anything specific yet. I was orienting myself, seeing whether returns had been logged in the same books as sales, which they had, noted in red pen as a convention that apparently persisted from the beginning. I was there for maybe 20 minutes before Patrice appeared in the doorway. She looked at me, looked at the open banker's box, looked at the ledger in my hands. She said, "What are you doing?" I said I was trying to find historical records for the titles I'd been flagging, that I wanted to see if there was a pattern going back further than the digital system. She was quiet for a moment. Not the brief pause from before. This was a longer consideration, the kind where someone is deciding what to say, rather than retrieving something they know. She said, "Close that up and come out front. We need to talk." So we talked. She made us both coffee, and she stood behind the desk and she told me, in the careful way of someone who has decided to give you the minimum version of a true thing, that the unmatched returns were known, that Gerald knew about them, that they had been happening at varying frequencies for as long as she'd been at the shop, that the previous 2 employees who'd held my position had both noticed eventually, and both had been told the same thing she was telling me now. Log them separately, process them normally, don't look into it further. I asked her why. She said, "Because looking into it further doesn't help you, and it doesn't help the shop." I asked her what that meant. She said, "It means exactly what it sounds like." Her voice wasn't unkind. She wasn't threatening me or brushing me off in the way of someone who doesn't care. It was more the tone of someone who has already traveled the road I was standing at the beginning of, and who decided at some point to stop walking it, and who now finds it genuinely difficult to watch someone else start walking. I asked her how many returns, total, across her 11 years. She looked at me for a moment. More than your 11. I said, "Do you know what the writing means? Inside the covers." Something shifted in her face. She hadn't expected me to have gotten that far, I think. She was quiet for longer this time, and then she said, "I told myself it was previous owners. Annotations." She picked up her coffee. I stopped opening them after a while. She went to help a customer. I stayed at the desk. The conversation was over in any operative sense. She'd said what she was going to say, and the rest was going to be closed off to me. I understood that. I also understood that she'd confirmed enough to remove the last exits I'd been keeping available to myself. The system gaps were not errors. The books were not misfiled. Gerald knew. Patrice knew. Whatever this was, it predated both of them. I am a reasonably grounded person. I'm saying that not to sound defensive, but because it bears on what I did next. I did not spiral into catastrophizing. I went home, I made dinner, I called Mara, who had had a bad day involving a group project and a classmate who hadn't done her portion, and I spent 45 minutes helping her figure out how to handle it. After she went to bed, and Dana and I had the brief logistics exchange that closes out those calls, I sat down with my notebook. I had 11 numbers. I had 11 books. I had the consistent markers, the condition, the line on the page block, the penciled word, the back cover numbers. I had Patrice's confirmation that this was known and long-standing. I had the fact that every author was dead. What I didn't have was any sense of direction. I knew the shape of something without knowing what the shape was the shape of. The 12th return came on a Friday. I was ready for it in a way that I couldn't have prepared specifically for, but that felt like preparation anyway. I'd been alert all week, more careful at the desk, watching each customer who came in with a book. When a man I didn't recognize set a novel on the desk, I knew before I pulled up the system that it wasn't going to be in there. It wasn't. The receipt was real. The book was in the familiar condition. He was gone before I could think of a pretext to extend the interaction. Inside the front cover, again. Inside the back cover, 9. I wrote it in my notebook. The sequence was now 14, 7, 22, 3, 19, 11, 7, 4, 16, 22, 14, 9. I looked at it. I was thinking about the repeating values again, the 3 pairs I'd identified before, now joined by a 4th instance. The 9 appeared for the first time. 14 appeared twice, 7 appeared twice, 22 appeared twice, and now I had 9. If the sequence was building towards something, it wasn't building linearly. I went back to the fiction section after close, when it was just me finishing up the end-of-day work, and I took all 12 books off their respective shelves and carried them to the desk and opened each one to its assigned number. Not the front cover this time. The back cover number is a page reference. Page 14 of the first book. Page 7 of the second. And so on. I read each page. I took notes on what they contained. And here is what I can tell you about that. Taken individually, they were just pages of literary fiction. A scene here, dialogue there, description. The ordinary texture of mid-century prose. Nothing alarming about any single page. What alarmed me was what they contained in common. Every page, every one of the 12, had a scene in which a character was waiting for something they didn't have words for. Not waiting in a dramatic sense, waiting in the quiet way. Sitting with a cup of something, or standing at a window, or pausing mid-task in a way the character themselves couldn't explain. The feeling of anticipation without a legible object. In one book, it was barely a sentence. In another, it was most of the page. But it was there in all 12. I know that's the kind of thing that sounds like I was reaching. Literary fiction is full of characters and states of unresolved anticipation. It's basically the mode of the form. I'm aware that I'd been primed to find patterns, and that a mind looking for a thing will often find it even in noise. I held all of that. But here's what I couldn't explain away. The page from book 6, the one with the number 11, was not page 11 of the main text. It was a book without standard page numbers in the front matter. It used Roman numerals for the preface, and the Arabic numbering started at page 1 with chapter 1. Page 11 in Arabic numbering was the 11th page of the actual narrative. But the preface was 7 pages long, meaning the 11th page of the physical book was Roman numeral 4, which was part of the author's note. The scene I was looking for, the waiting scene, wasn't on the numbered page 11. It was on physical page 11. The 14th physical page of book 1 similarly bridged the front matter into the first page of text in a way that only resolved if you counted from the physical first page of the object, not the first printed number. Someone had known the physical pagination of each specific edition, not just the title, the specific copy. I sat with that for a while. The shop was quiet. The lights were doing their usual thing. Outside on the street, a car went past with music playing, and then it was gone, and the quiet settled back. These weren't books that had been marked before they arrived, or if they had been, whoever marked them had known exactly which edition would end up in my hands when I reshelved them. Which meant either the marks were made here, in the shop, after the books were received, which meant access I couldn't account for, or they'd been made before the books arrived, and the specific copies had been directed to us deliberately. A third option existed, and I didn't let myself look at it directly yet. I noted it in my peripheral thinking and kept moving. I put the books back. I went home. I slept badly. On Sunday, I went to a library not for any reason related to the shop, or not only for that reason. My city has a decent main branch with a reasonable periodicals archive. I went ostensibly because I wanted to look at the original print runs of some of the titles, cross-reference edition details. But I also went because I wanted to be somewhere with other people that had nothing to do with Calloway and Reed. The reference librarian who helped me was efficient and kind, and located 3 of the 11 titles in their catalog without effort. We looked at the publication records together. I asked questions about print run variations, edition differences, the kind of question that sounds academic and probably bored her. She answered carefully. At one point, she pulled one of the books from their collection to show me something about the binding style, and I had to make a deliberate effort not to check the inside covers. I did check. She'd stepped away briefly. The librarian's copy was clean, no markings anywhere. The third option was still sitting in my peripheral vision when I got back to my apartment. I made coffee, and I sat down with my notebook, and I wrote it out explicitly for the first time, because I'd learned in my indexing work that an idea you're avoiding doesn't go away. It just contaminates your thinking from a direction you're not watching. Better to look at it directly. The option was this. The books were not being marked. The books were arriving with the marks, already present marks that had always been in them. The conditions, the line on the page block, the word, the numbers. All of it was inherent to these particular copies, in the same way the text itself was inherent to them. These were not books that had been altered. These were books that were this way, and what was directing them to this shop, to this desk, through the hands of different people who didn't know each other, was something I didn't have a framework for. That's the point at which the thing I'd been treating as a puzzle started to feel like a presence. I don't mean that in a melodramatic way. I mean that there is a qualitative difference in how your nervous system responds to a problem versus how it responds to something that is aware of you. I'd been living in the first state for 6 weeks. I shifted into the second state sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in November, and the shift was not loud. It was quiet in the way that a door opening silently behind you is quiet. The numbers weren't a code I needed to crack. They were a sequence that wasn't finished. 12 entries in something that went to at least 22. Maybe exactly 22. I was at entry 12. There were 10 more to come. The question I couldn't stop sitting with, the one that was underneath all the others, was not what the sequence meant when it was complete. It was something more immediate and more personal. Of the customers who had brought these books in, I had recognized several as regulars. They came in, they browsed, they bought things on separate visits. They were real people with apparently real receipts and apparently real reasons to return a book. I had never seen a single one of them buy anything. I went through the customer database that night, accessing it through the shop's remote login that Patrice had set up for inventory management. I searched by name where I had names from the receipts. I found most of them in the system. They had purchase histories, legitimate ones, books bought years ago, some of them. Gerald had been right that the system had gaps, but the core purchase records were there for most customers who'd been coming in for years. Except the purchases on the receipts for the 12 anomalous returns. Those specific transactions didn't appear in any account. The customers existed. The sales did not. The receipts were real, but the sales had never happened. I closed my laptop. I sat in my apartment, and I thought about Patrice saying I stopped opening them after a while. And I thought about the previous 2 employees who'd been told to log them separately and not look further. And I thought about how neither of those employees still worked at Callaway and Reed. And I thought about the fact that I hadn't asked Patrice why they'd left. I asked her the next morning. I waited until Gerald had been in and gone, until the mid-morning lull when the shop emptied out and Patrice was doing her usual Tuesday reorganization of the new arrivals display. I came around from behind the desk and I asked her directly, what happened to the 2 people before me who'd noticed the returns? She kept arranging books for a moment. Spine out, faced forward for a display copy. Marcus left after about 4 months, she said. Got a position at the university library. I wrote him a reference. And the other one, she set a book down. Her name was Soo Jin. She was here for 7 months. A pause. She didn't leave badly. She just stopped coming in. Called one morning and said she wasn't coming back. Gerald mailed her final check. When was that? 3 years ago, maybe. A little more. Did she say why? Patrice looked at me then. Not evasively. Something more like the look of a person deciding how much of a thing to hand someone when they're not sure the other person can carry it. She said the shop was making her feel like she was disappearing. She picked the book back up. I thought she meant it figuratively. I went back to the desk. A customer came in 20 minutes later, and I helped him find something for his wife's birthday. And I was present and competent and said the right things. And the whole time, one part of my mind was sitting very still with what Patrice had said. Not the content of it, so much as the word she'd used at the end. Figuratively. The implication folded inside it that she had, at some point, reconsidered whether Soo Jin had meant it figuratively or not, and had not fully settled the question. That afternoon, I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I searched for Soo Jin online. I had a last name from her. Patrice had mentioned it once in passing, back when she'd been telling me about the shop's history. It's not a common name. There were a few results. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 3 years. Last position listed as bookseller. A comment on a neighborhood forum from 4 years back about a street closure. Nothing after that. Nothing recent. That doesn't mean anything definitive. Plenty of people don't have an active online presence. I know that. But the LinkedIn profile had a profile photo, a woman in her early 30s, with close-cropped hair and a direct expression. And I found myself looking at it longer than I needed to, trying to read something into a 3-year-old photograph that it obviously couldn't tell me. I closed the tab. I opened my notebook. The 13th return came on a Wednesday. I had started watching the door with a specific quality of attention that was different from normal customer awareness. Not anxious exactly, more like calibrated. The way you listen differently in a room when you know a sound is coming, even if you don't know when. A woman I'd never seen before. She set the book on the desk, and I processed it before she could change her mind, or I could think better of it. Receipt real, system empty. Book in preserved condition. I thanked her. She nodded and left without browsing. I waited until she was gone and opened the front cover. Again. Back cover. 2. The sequence now had 13 entries. 14, 7, 22, 3, 19, 11, 7, 4, 16, 22, 14, 9, 2. I stared at that 2 for a long time. It was the smallest number yet. And something about the sequence had been nagging at me since I'd written down the first 12. Not the meaning of the numbers, but their range. They all fell between 1 and 22. I'd thought about the 22 major arcana and dismissed it, but I kept returning to that ceiling. 22. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. I knew that from somewhere, some half-remembered context. A literature course, maybe. Or the kind of ambient knowledge that accumulates when you spend enough time around books. It wasn't a system I knew in any detail, but the number stopped being a coincidence when I put it next to the others. 11 returns had produced values that all fell within a 22-item system. 3 pairs of repeats. Now, a 13th entry. I'm not a mystically inclined person. I want to be clear about that. I think the reason certain ideas get attached to certain numbers is the same reason constellations look like Bayes pattern recognition is what human cognition does, relentlessly, whether or not the pattern is really there. But I also know that sometimes the pattern is really there. That's the whole premise of indexing. You're not inventing the structure. You're finding the one that exists. I looked up the Hebrew alphabet that evening. The 22nd letter is Tav. Its traditional meaning involves completion, or a mark, or a signature. The first letter is Aleph. The numbers in my sequence, if I mapped them to that alphabet, produced a string of letters that I wrote out in transliteration and then sat looking at for a while. It didn't spell a word. Not in Hebrew, not transliterated into English, not rearranged. 13 letters selected from a 22-letter alphabet don't necessarily produce language, especially if the sequence is incomplete. I was still 9 entries short of whatever the full sequence was meant to be. I went to bed. I woke up at 3 in the morning with a thought that had apparently been waiting for me. I hadn't checked the pages of book 13. I'd been so focused on the back cover number that I'd broken my own process. I couldn't do anything about that at 3 in the morning. I lay in the dark, and I thought about the word again. I'd spent weeks thinking about it as a note left by a reader, or a note left by whoever had marked these books. I hadn't thought carefully enough about who it was addressed to. Again is a word that presupposes a previous time. I'd been working at Callaway and Reed for 3 months. Marcus had lasted 4 months. Sue Jin had lasted 7. The returns had been happening, according to Patrice, for as long as she'd been there 11 years. Whatever this was had cycled through multiple people, multiple instances of someone reaching a point of recognition before stopping or being stopped. again, was not a message to me specifically. It was a message to whoever was currently standing at the desk. Again, we are doing this. Again, someone is here. Again, the books arrive. Again, someone notices. Again, the sequence proceeds. What happened when the sequence was complete was the question I'd been skirting. But now, at 3 in the morning, I found I was less afraid of that question than I was of a different one. The sequence wasn't complete yet. There were 9 entries still to come. The sequence moved at its own pace, sometimes 2 returns in a week, sometimes a gap of 10 days. At current rate, completing it would take another 2 months, possibly more. What happened to the people who didn't stay long enough to see it through? I got up and sat at my kitchen table with the lights on until it was late enough to be morning. On Thursday, Gerald's day, I arrived early and went straight to the back room. I had 20 minutes before Gerald arrived. I found the ledger from the earliest years, 1987, 1988, and I started checking the return entries in red pen. Pre-Patrice, pre-digital, handwritten. It took me a few minutes to calibrate my reading to the handwriting of whoever had kept the log in 1989, and then I started moving through the pages. Returns were common. I wasn't looking for all returns. I was looking for the ones that had been flagged. There must have been something, some notation. When I found it, it was a small mark in the margin, just a horizontal line in pencil beside certain entries. Not every return, specific ones. I went through 3 years of logs in 15 minutes, and I found 14 pencil-marked returns across that period, distributed unevenly, clustered in a way that reminded me of my own pattern. Then Gerald arrived and I closed the box and went out front. He made his coffee. He talked about the distributor dispute, which had apparently escalated. I listened and made appropriate sounds. When he went to settle at the desk with his laptop, I said, casually, that I'd been thinking about the inventory gap issue and had been looking at the old records to understand it better. He looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, not the administrative inconvenience frown, something more careful. He said, "What did you find?" I said I'd found the margin marks, that it looked like the same kind of anomalous returns going back to at least 1989. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did Patrice talk to you?" I said she had, briefly. He said, "Then you know what we do with them." I said, "I know what you've told people to do with them. I don't know why." He closed his laptop. This is the most present I have ever seen Gerald, in 3 months of watching a man successfully avoid full presence in his own life. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether they're owed something real. He said, "My father opened this shop. When he died, he left it to me. He left me a letter with it." He picked up his coffee cup and didn't drink from it. He told me there would be books that came back that shouldn't have. He told me to process them and shelve them and let them alone. I said, "Did he say why?" He said the shop had been built on a piece of land that had changed hands a long time before him. He said the people who sold it to the previous owner had certain attachments to the location. He said some things had been going on there before the shop existed that he didn't fully understand, and that the shop had inherited something from that, and that the best policy was to not interfere with it. I waited. He said the books were a form of record-keeping, his word. Gerald turned the coffee cup in his hands. He said whatever was being recorded didn't care about us specifically. It just needed a location, a system, something ordered. "A cataloging system," I said. He looked at me. He said as long as we processed them normally and shelved them and let them alone, nothing happened. He'd done it for 18 years and nothing happened. And the employees who noticed, 2 quit, 1 is still here. He meant Patrice. And you. I said. "The books have writing in them." The way his face changed told me he didn't know that. He genuinely did not know about the word, the numbers, the page references. Patrice hadn't told him, or Patrice hadn't looked far enough to find it. I watched him absorb it, and I watched him decide in real time to close back down. He said, "Process them and shelve them." He opened his laptop. I went to the desk. I thought about his father's word, record keeping, something that needed a location, a system, something ordered. It had found a bookstore, of course it had found a bookstore, a cataloging system with a public-facing return policy, a way for objects to arrive and be received and be assigned a location and filed. It wasn't using the shop, it was using the function of the shop. The same function would have worked in a library, an archive, a post office with organized boxes. Any system that received, logged, and housed. That evening, after close, I stayed late under the pretext of a receiving backlog. Patrice left at 6:30. I waited until her car was gone from the block. I took all 13 books from the shelves again and carried them to the desk. I looked at each of the designated pages, the page corresponding to the back cover number, counted physically from the first page of the object. I'd done this with the first 12 and found the waiting motif on every one. I hadn't yet checked book 13. Page 2 of book 13, the second physical page, which was the title page, had 4 lines of text on it. Title, author, publisher, year. No scene, no prose, no waiting. I turned to the actual second page of narrative. Same thing. A scene of 2 people in a kitchen. Ordinary. No waiting motif that I could identify. I went back to the title page. I read it slowly. Publisher was a small press, long defunct, based in a city 3 states from here. Year was 1971. And then, below the year, in the same neat pencil, "You're at 13. Not again. Not a number. A direct address." I put the book down on the desk. I stood in the empty shop in the mixed light of the clip-on lamps and the street light coming through the front window. The shop made its usual sounds, the old building settling, the refrigerator unit in the back room cycling on. I picked it up again. "Below, you're at 13. Don't shelve the last one." That was all. I stood there trying to think about what the last one meant. The last of 22. 9 more returns. 9 more books arriving through different hands, with real receipts for sales that never happened, in conditions that shouldn't be possible. Whenever the 22nd came, I was not supposed to shelve it. I thought about Soo-Jin. I thought about Marcus. I thought about whether either of them had reached 13, had found the message, had decided what to do about it. I thought about the fact that whatever had written "Don't shelve the last one" had done so in advance of my counting, had known I'd reached 13, had been tracking the same sequence I'd been tracking, from a position I couldn't locate or name. I put all 13 books back, exactly where they'd been. I locked the shop and walked to my car, and sat in it for a few minutes before starting the engine. The street was ordinary. A couple walked past with a dog. A bus went by. The city was doing what cities do at 7 in the evening in late autumn, which is contract slightly against the dark and the cold and carry on. I thought about what I was going to do when the 22nd book came in. I already knew, if I'm honest. I think I'd known since the message on the title page. Maybe since 3 in the morning when I'd understood what again was really saying. The sequence was going to complete. I was going to be here when it did. Not because of curiosity. I'd promised myself curiosity wasn't enough, but because of something that connected back to all those evenings, eating the same 4 meals, to the particular tone in Dana's voice, to Mara's laugh on the phone, to the specific quality of needing to be a person who sees a thing through when the seeing through means something. 9 more books were coming. Someone, or something, had left me a message inside a dead man's novel. I started the car and drove home. The next 9 came over 6 weeks. I won't account for each one in detail because the individual arrivals had stopped being the point. Different people, always strangers or near strangers, always with the real receipt for the sale that wasn't in the system. The books were always in that condition. Preserved, clean, the line on the page block like a watermark from somewhere else. I processed each one, logged it in my notebook, pulled it at the end of my shift to check the back cover number, found the page, read the scene. Every scene was the same underneath its surface differences. Someone waiting. The particular interior stillness of a person who has stopped expecting the thing they're waiting for to arrive in any form they can name. I called Mara twice a week during this period instead of once. I don't think she noticed the increase. We talked about her school project on ecosystems, about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend that resolved itself in the way those things resolve at that age completely, without residue, in about 4 days. I took her to a bookstore on her birthday in March, a different bookstore, a big chain near the mall, and she chose 3 books, and I bought all 3 without looking at the prices, which was a kind of small defiance of the financial reality I was still living in. Dana raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it later. I said it was fine. It was fine. The shop continued in its ordinary way. Gerald came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Patrice ran things. I shelved and received and helped customers and processed returns. After our conversation, Gerald didn't raise the subject again, and neither did I. Patrice and I had a kind of unspoken agreement not to discuss it. Not a tense agreement. Not an avoidance born of fear. More like the agreement between 2 people on a long drive that certain topics belong to rest stops rather than the road itself. We'd talk about it when we stopped. Until then, we drove. The 21st book came in on a Tuesday in late March, 2 days after Mara's birthday. A man I'd seen once before, he'd been in to browse about 3 weeks earlier, hadn't bought anything, set it on the desk mid-afternoon. I processed it. He left. I pulled the book at close. Back cover, 1. The sequence complete to 21 read 14, 7, 22, 3, 19, 11, 7, 4, 16, 22, 14, 9, 2, 8, 5, 13, 20, 1, 17, 6, 1. 2 ones now, 3 sevens. The repetitions had been accumulating throughout, not random, I was certain of that, but I'd stopped trying to decode the numerical logic directly. Whatever the sequence spelled or signaled in its complete form was something I was going to have to wait to understand. I checked the page. Physical page 1 of the 21st book was the half-title page, just the title. Nothing else, centered on an otherwise blank leaf. Below it, in the pencil that I knew now, as well as my own handwriting, tomorrow. 1 word, not again, not an address, not an instruction, a statement of fact, or something functioning as one. I stood at the desk in the empty shop for a long time. Tomorrow was Wednesday. I was scheduled to open. I'd be here alone until Patrice came in at 9. I thought about leaving. I want to be honest about that. I considered not coming in. I thought about calling out sick. Thought about what I'd say. Thought about the domino of consequences that followed from that, and whether any of them would actually protect me from whatever tomorrow was supposed to mean. And I understood fairly quickly that the answer was no. You don't get to not be at the place where a thing is happening by not showing up to the building. If 6 weeks of evidence had taught me anything, it was that whatever was using the shop was not limited by the shop's walls or hours. The receipts proved that. The customers proved that. The thing had reach that extended into ordinary life in ways I couldn't map. I'd be safer knowing what happened than not knowing. I told myself that. I mostly believed it. I went home and made dinner and went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than I'd expected to, which I think says something about the difference between dread and readiness. The 22nd book came in at 8:47 in the morning. I was behind the desk. I'd been there since 8, earlier than usual, doing nothing in particular, tidying receipts, straightening the display near the door, making coffee, behaving like a person who was simply opening a shop. The street outside was gray with early spring overcast, the light flat and even, and there was almost no foot traffic. The woman who came in was someone I recognized. She was the librarian from the main branch, the reference librarian who had helped me look up edition details 4 months earlier. I recognized her immediately, the efficiency, the way she moved in a library or a bookshop, with the particular ease of someone who has organized space professionally. She wasn't wearing her library lanyard. She was dressed differently, but it was her. She set a book on the desk and slid a receipt across to me without speaking. I looked at the receipt. I looked at the book. I processed the return. She stood there while I did it. Most of the other 21 had left immediately or browsed briefly. She stood at the desk and watched me work, not with any pressure, just with a kind of patient attention. I gave her the refund. She took it. She was about to turn away, and I said, "Did you know you were doing this?" She looked at me, not surprised. "No, I was doing what?" "Returning a book you didn't buy." She was quiet for a moment. "I bought a book last week," she said. "I don't remember the title. I thought I'd left it at work, but I found it this morning and the receipt was in the bag." She paused. "This isn't a book I read." She wasn't lying. I could tell that, not with certainty, but with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 months watching people at a desk and learning how they talk about things they know versus things they're uncertain about. She was genuinely uncertain. She'd found a book and a receipt and had returned it the way you return something you don't want taking up space. I said, "Thank you." She accepted that as a normal customer service conclusion and left. I held the 22nd book. The instruction had been clear. Don't shelve the last one. That was all it had said. No elaboration. No indication of what to do instead. I set it on the desk in front of me and looked at it. Literary fiction, mid-century, a writer I'd encountered in my research. Died 1967. 2 novels, almost completely out of circulation now. The cover was cloth-bound in a way that indicated it was older than the other 21, possibly a first edition, though I didn't know enough about this particular title to confirm that. It was in the same condition as all the others. The line on the page block was there, level and faint. I opened the front cover. Again. I turned to the back cover. 22. Physical page. 22. I counted from the first page of the object. Page 22 was the first page of the novel's 2nd chapter. It began mid-scene, a man sitting at a desk in a room that had been described in the 1st chapter, looking at something he'd received in the mail that he couldn't immediately identify. The prose was spare and precise, the voice dry in the way of that era. The man in the scene held the thing he'd received, and he understood, the narrator said, that it had not been sent to him. It had been sent to whoever was at that address. He happened to be there. The thing had found its destination without knowing his name. I read the page twice. It was like all the others, just a page of a novel. It was also, and I knew this was the pattern recognition working, knew it, and couldn't stop it. The only page in the sequence that was about receiving something rather than waiting for something. 21 pages about waiting, and then this one. a man holding a thing he hadn't expected, understanding that he'd been found by location rather than by name. I sat with that. Then I opened the notebook and looked at the complete sequence. 14, 7, 22, 3, 19, 11, 7, 4, 16, 22, 14, 9, 2, 8, 5, 13, 20, 1, 17, 6, 1, 22. I looked at it for a long time, and then I did the thing I should have done months earlier, which was stop trying to decode it and ask what function it served rather than what it meant. This is an indexing instinct. You don't always need to understand a system to understand what the system is for. The system had been logging returns for at least 35 years. The same marks, the same condition, the same format. Gerald's father had called it record keeping. It had moved through multiple people, however many employees, however many cycles of someone noticing and being told to stop. And it had continued regardless. It didn't need anyone to understand it. It just needed the shop to function, the returns to be processed, the books to be shelved. The only deviation from that pattern had been the messages, which had started, as far as I could tell, when I'd started opening the books past the front cover. The messages had responded to my investigation. The sequence had been there before me, but the communication layer, you're at 13. Don't shelve the last one. Tomorrow that was responsive. That was something that had noticed I was looking. And now it was telling me not to shelve the last one. Not as a warning, not as a threat, as a distinction. The first 21 had been shelved and then, eventually, returned and shelved again. Maybe that had happened across multiple cycles, multiple employees. The same books circulating through the shop over decades. Gerald's father's record keeping, an archive that maintained itself through the shop's own return policy, using the infrastructure of a functioning business to persist. The books went out, came back, got shelved, went out again through purchase or browsing or some mechanism I couldn't see, came back again. Cycling. The 22nd book was different. Its instruction was to not be shelved, to not re-enter the cycle. I thought about what it means when you pull a book from circulation. In a library, that's called weeding. In a bookstore, it's remaindering or donation or pulping. You remove it from the active catalog. You end its participation in the system. Whatever this was had spent, by my rough estimation, decades maintaining a presence in this location through 22 books in rotation. And now the 22nd was on my desk, and the instruction was, don't shelve it. I sat with that until Patrice came in at 9. She looked at the book on the desk. She'd seen enough of them to recognize the condition. She looked at me. I said, it's the last one. She set her bag down slowly. How do you know? I told her about the messages. All of them. I hadn't told her before I'd been keeping the notebook close, keeping my investigation interior. But the thing had told me it was the last one, and I wasn't willing to hold that alone anymore. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is not her usual mode. And by the end of it, she was sitting on the stool behind the desk with her coffee getting cold. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Gerald's not going to like it." "Gerald doesn't have to know today." She looked at the book. "What do you think happens if you just take it home?" "I don't know." "What do you think happens if you shelve it anyway?" "Then it goes back into the cycle. Someone buys it eventually. Someone returns it. It keeps going." I paused. "I think that's what it's been doing. I think that's all it's been doing." "And pulling one book from the cycle, I don't know," I said again, which was the honest answer. Patrice was quiet for a long moment. A customer came in, browsed, bought a paperback, left. normal morning. The light outside had gone from flat to a pale, washed yellow as the overcast thinned. She said, "Soo Jin called me, about 8 months after she left. She wasn't looking at me. She called to apologize for leaving without notice. We talked for a while. She said she'd started seeing the same books in other places. Used bookstores, library sales, a stack on a free table outside someone's building. She kept finding them. She said it had followed her out of the shop." A pause. I told her it was a coincidence, that literary fiction circulates. She said she knew that. She wasn't crazy. She just wanted someone to know. I looked at the book on the desk. "She's fine," Patrice said quickly. "I checked in a year ago. She's teaching. She's fine. But she stopped going into bookstores." I picked up the 22nd book. I held it with both hands. It weighed what a book weighs. It felt like what it was. Old paper, cloth binding, decades of slow oxidation sealed in by careful storage. It felt like something that had been kept intact for a very specific purpose over a very long time. I thought about Gerald's father's letter. The best policy was to not interfere with it. I thought about 35 years of that policy, and what it had produced, and who it had protected. I put the book in my bag. Patrice watched me do it. She didn't say anything. I think she'd already made her decision before she told me about Soo Jin, that telling me was her way of giving me what I needed to make mine. I finished my shift. I did everything normally. At close, I took the bag home, and I put the book on my kitchen table, and I sat across from it, and I ate dinner. I kept it for 2 weeks. I slept fine. Nothing followed me home. Nothing changed in the shop. The remaining 21 books stayed on their shelves, and no new anomalous returns came in. The cycle had stopped, or it was paused, or it was waiting in some way I didn't have the instruments to measure. On a Sunday in April, I drove to the lake on the edge of the city, the reservoir with the walking path, where I'd taken Mara sometimes when she was smaller and the drive was easier. I sat on a bench for a while. I'd brought the book with me. I want to be careful here about what I claim. I don't know what was in those books. I don't know what was using the shop or why, or what the complete sequence of 22 numbers indicated, or whether the thing that had been maintaining itself there for decades had genuine intention behind it, or was simply a mechanism running in the only way it knew. Gerald's father thought it was record-keeping. Maybe it was. Records of what, I couldn't tell you. What I know is that I took the 22nd book from the system that had been running it, and I held it on a bench by the reservoir, and I read the first chapter, really read it, not looking for marked pages or penciled words, just reading it the way you read a book someone hands you. And it was good. The writing was careful and quiet, and the story was about a man sorting through a house after his father died, organizing objects, trying to understand what a life amounted to when you reduced it to its contents. It was a good novel. It deserved to be read. I didn't find any additional messages, just the text. I left the book on the bench when I left. I know that sounds careless, like I was returning it to circulation, which is exactly what I'd been told not to do. But there's a difference between the circulation of a bookstore, a system, a catalog, a function, and a bench by a reservoir, where someone walking their dog might pick it up and take it home and read it. One is a mechanism. The other is just how books travel. Maybe I was wrong about that distinction. I've thought about it a lot. When I got back to the car, I had a voicemail from Mara, asking if we could get breakfast before she went back to her mother's next weekend. She'd learned to make a specific kind of eggs that she wanted to show me. Her voice was the voice of a 9-year-old who is very proud of herself and trying not to sound too proud. I drove home and called her back and said yes, absolutely, I would be there. The shop is still there. I'm still there. No anomalous returns since April, which is now almost 4 months. The 21 books are still on the shelves, shelved by author's last name in the fiction section, indistinguishable from anything else. Sometimes I walk past them in the course of a shift, and I don't stop. There's nothing to see. Patrice and I don't talk about it. Gerald doesn't know what I did. The notebook is in my kitchen drawer. The only thing I keep coming back to, the thing that sits in me differently from the rest of it, is not the books, or the sequence, or the messages, or the question of what was using that system, and for how long. Those are large questions, and large questions have a way of becoming abstract with distance. What stays specific is this. Somewhere in this city there are 21 books on a shelf, waiting to be part of something I interrupted. And somewhere there is a woman named Sue Jin, who stopped going into bookstores 8 months after she left a job that paid $11 an hour. And she is fine. She is teaching, but she doesn't go into bookstores. And somewhere, or maybe nowhere, a bench by the reservoir holds a cloth-bound novel from 1962 that someone might have picked up by now, or might not have. I don't check.